I never thought the forest near our town could hold secrets. It was just a dense, sprawling patch of trees that stretched for miles, but it always had an unsettling stillness about it, a kind of quiet that didn't feel natural. One day, I decided to go explore. I figured it would be like any other hike, peaceful, refreshing. I couldn't have been more wrong. The deeper I ventured, the more the air seemed to change. It felt heavier, almost suffocating. There was no birdsong, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Didn't feel like the peaceful escape I had hoped for. As I walked further, the trees seemed to close in around me, their trunks thicker, their branches more twisted than they had appeared at the edge of the forest. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard something, a faint whisper. I stopped, thinking it was the wind, but there was no wind. It was a voice, too low to understand, but undeniably human. My heart started to pound as I strained to listen. It seemed to come from every direction at once, echoing through the trees. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was another hiker, lost like me. I called out, but there was no reply, only more whispers. Panic set in when I realized I couldn't remember which direction I had come from. Every tree looked the same, every path unfamiliar. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like they were trying to tell me something. My pulse quickened. I started walking faster, hoping to find the trail, but the ground beneath me felt wrong, uneven. I looked down and saw something I hadn't noticed before. Small carvings in the dirt, like symbols or markings I couldn't understand. I picked up the pace, heart hammering in my chest, when suddenly I stumbled upon a clearing. It was the first break in the dense trees I had seen for hours. In the center of the clearing was something that didn't belong, an old, dilapidated cabin, its roof caved in and windows shattered. There was no reason for it to be there, so deep in the forest. No path, no signs of life. I approached cautiously, the whispers now so loud I could barely think. As I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaked beneath my feet. The door was ajar, hanging off one hinge, and the interior was dark and decayed. But then I saw it, a figure barely visible in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for me. The whispers suddenly stopped, leaving a deafening silence. I turned to run, but the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees towering and menacing. I was trapped. I don't know how I made it out. Everything after that is a blur, running, stumbling, branches tearing at my skin. But somehow, I found my way back to the edge of the forest. The whispers were gone, but the memory of that figure in the cabin stays with me. I never went back to those woods, and I warn everyone who mentions hiking there, because whatever's out there, it doesn't want to be disturbed.
The plan was simple. My girlfriend and I would spend the weekend camping in the forest. It was supposed to be a chance to disconnect, to get away from the noise of the city and just be alone together. The first day was perfect. We set up camp near a river, the sound of the water flowing over the rocks, calming and peaceful. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and watched the stars as the night fell. But the next day, everything changed. We decided to explore deeper into the forest. There was a trail that led into the more remote areas, where fewer people ventured. The air felt cooler as we walked, and the trees grew taller, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight. It was quiet, almost too quiet. But neither of us said anything. We were enjoying the solitude. After about an hour, we came across something strange, a circle of stones, carefully placed in the middle of the path. It didn't seem like something that would occur naturally. My girlfriend bent down to examine them, but I felt uneasy. Something about it didn't feel right. The air seemed to grow even colder, and the trees creaked ominously around us. I suggested we turn back, but she laughed it off. It was just stones, after all. We continued on, but the further we went, the more unsettled I became. The forest around us seemed darker, more oppressive. Then we started hearing noises, soft, indistinct sounds like footsteps behind us. But every time I turned, there was nothing. My girlfriend noticed it too, and her expression grew serious. We picked up the pace, but the noises followed us, growing louder, closer. Suddenly, we stumbled upon another clearing, but this one wasn't like the peaceful meadow we had seen earlier. This one was different. In the center stood a tree, gnarled and twisted, with strange symbols carved into its bark. Around it, the ground was littered with bones. They looked old, but the sight of them sent a chill down my spine. My girlfriend grabbed my hand, her face pale. We both knew we needed to leave now, but as we turned to leave, the forest seemed to come alive. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches swaying even though there was no wind. The footsteps we had heard earlier returned, but this time, they were all around us. We ran, heart pounding, not caring about the path, just desperate to get out. The forest seemed to twist and shift, every direction leading deeper into the woods instead of out. We finally made it back to camp, breathless and shaken. But when we got there, something was wrong. Our tent had been slashed open, our belongings scattered, and the stones, the same ones we had seen on the path, were arranged in a circle around our campsite. We didn't stay to find out who or what had done it. We packed up as quickly as we could and left the forest without looking back. That night, as we drove home, neither of us spoke. But we both knew something had followed us out of those woods, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for us to come back.
There's something about a group of friends exploring a forest together that feels like the start of a great adventure. We were all excited, laughing and joking as we headed down the trail, backpacks loaded with supplies. It was supposed to be a weekend of camping and fun, but as we moved deeper into the forest, the atmosphere started to shift. The trees were dense, towering above us, blocking out much of the sunlight. The further we went, the more the forest seemed to swallow us whole. We started noticing strange things. Trees bent at odd angles, roots twisted into unnatural shapes. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence. My friends and I exchanged nervous glances, but we pushed on, not wanting to admit we were spooked. After a few hours, we came across something unexpected. A series of old rusted metal gates, half buried in the undergrowth. They looked ancient, like they had been part of something long forgotten. None of us could figure out what they were doing there, so far from any civilization. One of my friends suggested it was part of an old fence, but the others weren't so sure. It felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. As we walked past the gates, the forest seemed to change again. The air grew thicker, and a strange smell filled the air, damp, decaying, like something rotting deep beneath the earth. That's when the noises started. At first, it was just small sounds, like something rustling in the bushes. But then we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere ahead. My heart skipped a beat. We all froze, listening. The growl came again, closer this time. My friend whispered, "What the hell is that?" But no one had an answer. We stood there, paralyzed, when suddenly the bushes ahead of us moved. Something big was out there, just beyond the trees. We couldn't see it, but we could feel its presence, watching us, waiting. Panic set in, and we turned to leave. But the path we had come down was gone. The trees had shifted, the trail swallowed by the dense undergrowth. We were trapped. The growling grew louder, more aggressive, and whatever was out there began to move. We ran, scrambling through the trees, not knowing where we were going, just desperate to get away. Eventually, we stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for breath. The growling had stopped, but the fear still lingered. One of my friends pulled out his phone, trying to get a signal, but there was nothing. We were completely isolated, lost in a forest that didn't want us there. We spent hours trying to find our way back, but the forest seemed to twist and change with every step. It wasn't until nightfall that we finally found the trail again. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the car, too shaken to process what had just happened. To this day, none of us can explain what we heard or how the forest seemed to come alive around us. All I know is that something was out there, watching us, and it didn't want us to leave.
There's a place in the forest that people don't talk about much, an old fire watchtower, long abandoned. It's said to have been closed down after a tragedy, but no one ever seems to know the full story. One weekend, my girlfriend and I decided to hike out to see it. We weren't scared, just curious. We didn't believe the rumors. The hike started out normal enough. The forest was quiet, the air crisp, but the closer we got to the watchtower, the more uneasy I felt. The path became overgrown, the trees thicker and darker. There were no signs of wildlife, no birds, no animals, just silence. My girlfriend seemed to sense it too, but neither of us said anything. When we finally reached the tower, it was more rundown than I expected. The wood was rotting, the windows shattered, and the metal stairs that spiraled up to the top were rusted and worn. But something about it drew us in. We stood at the base, looking up at the towering structure, and for a moment I felt like we were being watched. I shook off the feeling and started to climb the stairs. My girlfriend followed, though I could tell she was hesitant. As we ascended, the air grew colder. By the time we reached the top, it was freezing, far colder than it should have been for that time of year. The wind howled through the broken windows, and the tower swayed slightly, making the whole structure feel unstable. We stood there for a while, taking in the view, but something was off. The forest below looked different from up here, darker, more menacing. And then we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. My girlfriend grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding. We looked around, but there was no one there. The tapping continued, echoing through the tower. It seemed to come from below us, from the very base of the tower. I leaned over the railing, peering down, but all I saw was darkness. My stomach churned with dread. Suddenly the whole tower creaked, the metal groaning under the strain. It felt like it was going to collapse. Without thinking, we bolted down the stairs, the tapping growing louder with each step. As we reached the ground, we didn't stop running, we didn't look back, we didn't talk about it until we were safely back at the car. Even then, we couldn't explain what had happened. All I know is that something was in that tower with us. And whatever it was, it didn't want us to leave. It was supposed to be a relaxing day out in the forest. I had brought my wife and kids along, hoping for a peaceful picnic in the woods. We found a nice spot, close to a small stream, where the kids could play and we could unwind, but something felt off from the beginning. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no animals, just the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the breeze. My wife noticed it too, but we brushed it off, thinking we were just overthinking things. After all, we were here to relax. The kids ran off to explore while we set up the picnic. They didn't go far, just to the edge of the clearing where the trees grew denser. I kept an eye on them, but something about the way the trees looked in the distance made me uneasy. They seemed wrong, twisted, like they were bending towards something unseen. It wasn't long before the kids came back, their faces pale, eyes wide. "Dad, there's something out there," my son whispered. I exchanged a glance with my wife, who looked just as confused as I felt. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "We heard something," my daughter said, her voice shaking. "It was like someone calling us, but it didn't sound right." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I stood up, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. "It's probably just the wind," I said, trying to reassure them. But even I didn't believe that. We decided to pack up early and head back. As we gathered our things, the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees darker and more menacing than they had been before. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We hadn't gone far when the noises started, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. My wife grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping was unmistakable now, echoing through the trees. It seemed to come from all around us, but no matter where I looked, I couldn't see anything. Just endless rows of trees looming like silent sentinels. The kids huddled close to us, their excitement from earlier replaced by fear. I didn't want to scare them any more than they already were, but the truth was, I was terrified too. "Let's keep moving," I said, trying to sound calm, though I could feel the panic rising in my throat. We picked up the pace, heading in the direction of the car, but the tapping followed us, never too far behind. It felt like something was pursuing us, though we never saw what it was. The trees seemed to shift and twist the deeper we went, as if they were bending in on us, blocking our path. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything, but the forest was empty, except for that sound. Suddenly the tapping stopped. The silence was worse. It was so oppressive, so thick, that I could almost feel it pressing against my skin. My wife squeezed my hand, her eyes scanning the trees. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice trembling. "This doesn't look like the way we came." She was right. Nothing looked familiar anymore. The forest had changed around us. The path we had been walking on was gone, swallowed up by the undergrowth. My chest tightened with dread as I realized we were lost. "We just have to keep going," I said, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "We'll find the car." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure. The trees seemed to be playing tricks on us, leading us in circles. Every step felt like we were sinking deeper into something we couldn't escape. The kids were silent now, clinging to their mother as we pushed through the thick brush. My every sense was on high alert, my ears straining to catch the faintest sound. Then I heard it, a soft, distant whisper. I stopped in my tracks, my blood running cold. It was faint, almost like someone calling my name, but it was distorted, wrong. I turned to my wife, and from the look on her face, I knew she had heard it too. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I admitted, my eyes darting around the trees. The whispering grew louder, though still impossible to understand, like it was being carried on the wind. The forest around us seemed to pulse with life, the trees shifting, groaning under the strain of something unseen. And then we saw it. Up ahead, through the trees, there was a clearing, and in the middle of it stood a massive, twisted tree. Its bark was black, charred, and its branches reached out like skeletal fingers, clawing at the sky. But that wasn't what stopped me dead in my tracks. It was what was hanging from the tree. Shapes, dozens of them, hanging from the branches by thick ropes, swaying gently in the breeze. At first I thought they were some kind of strange fruit or objects tied up there, but as we got closer, I realized what they were. Dolls. Ragged, old-fashioned dolls, their faces worn and cracked, their bodies limp. They hung in rows, motionless except for the slight sway caused by the wind. A sick feeling twisted in my gut. The whispers had stopped, but the forest felt alive with something dark, something ancient. I stepped closer to the tree, drawn to it despite the overwhelming sense of dread that filled me. Then, without warning, the whispers returned, louder this time, angry, accusing. They seemed to surround us, coming from every direction. The kids screamed, and my wife grabbed them, pulling them back. "We need to leave, now." I didn't need to be told twice. We turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, the whispers chasing us, growing louder with each step. The forest seemed to come alive, the trees bending, twisting, reaching for us with their branches. It was as if the forest itself was trying to keep us from leaving. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like hours, but eventually we burst through the tree line and into the open. The car was there, sitting exactly where we had left it. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I grabbed my family, shoved them into the car, and tore out of there as fast as I could. We didn't speak on the drive home. The kids were too scared to ask questions, and my wife just sat there, staring out the window, her face pale and her hands trembling. We've never talked about what happened in that forest. But I know we all felt the same thing. There's something in those woods, something dark and ancient, something that watches, waits. And whatever it is, it doesn't like to be disturbed. There's something about forests that makes them feel endless. It's easy to get lost among the trees, to feel like the world outside simply doesn't exist anymore. That's how I felt the day I set out alone, eager to explore the vast stretch of forest that bordered the town I had recently moved to. I'd heard stories about people getting lost there, but I shrugged them off. I wasn't some novice. I'd been hiking for years. The trail I chose was one of the lesser-known paths, barely marked and overgrown in some places. It didn't bother me. In fact, it made the hike feel more adventurous. As I walked, the sounds of the outside world quickly faded away. The hum of distant cars, the occasional bark of a dog, it all vanished, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the crunch of twigs beneath my boots. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed. The trees grew taller, their trunks thicker, their branches forming a dense canopy overhead. Sunlight barely filtered through, casting the forest floor in an eerie, muted glow. The path, once clear, started to fade, the undergrowth creeping over it like a living thing. Still, I wasn't worried. I had my compass, my map. I could find my way back, no problem. But as I continued, something strange began to happen. The path I had been following, the one I had been sure of just moments ago, seemed to vanish. I stopped, frowning, scanning the forest for any sign of it. There was nothing, just trees in every direction. I pulled out my compass, but when I looked at it, my heart sank. The needle was spinning wildly, as if it couldn't decide which direction was north. I tapped it, shook it, but it didn't help. It was completely useless. A cold dread crept over me as I realized I was lost. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I could still find my way back. I just needed to retrace my steps. But no matter which direction I went, the trees all looked the same. I couldn't even find the faintest trace of the path I had been following. Panic started to set in. The forest felt different now, more oppressive, as if it were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The air grew colder, the wind picking up and rustling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like whispering. I walked for what felt like hours, my heart racing, my legs growing tired. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't find my way out. The trees seemed to shift around me, leading me in circles, trapping me in some kind of endless loop. And then, just as I was about to give up, I saw it, a small clearing up ahead, Relieved, I rushed toward it, hoping it would lead me to some kind of trail or road. But when I stepped into the clearing, I froze. In the center of the clearing was a stone circle, ancient and worn, covered in moss. And standing in the middle of that circle was a single tree, unlike any I had seen before. It was twisted and gnarled, its bark blackened as if it had been burned. Its branches reached out like claws, and hanging from those branches were hundreds of ropes, swaying gently in the breeze. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something wrong about this place, something deeply unnatural. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get away. Eventually, I stumbled out of the forest, disoriented and exhausted. I don't know how I made it out, but I've never gone back to those woods since. There's something in there, something that twists the forest around you, makes you lost. And once it has you, it doesn't want to let you go. There's a strange kind of silence that only exists in forests after dark. It's not like the quiet you get in the city, or even in your home. It's deeper, more unsettling. I had never intended to be in the forest at night, but my hike had taken longer than expected, and by the time I realized the sun was setting, it was too late. The trailhead was miles away, and I had no choice but to keep going, hoping I'd make it back before darkness completely swallowed the forest. But the sun set faster than I expected. One moment, the trees were bathed in the warm orange glow of dusk, and the next, they were shadows, dark and looming, the trail ahead disappearing into blackness. I cursed under my breath, pulling out my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but it did little to ease the growing sense of unease in my chest. The forest at night was completely different from the one I had hiked through during the day. The trees seemed closer, their branches hanging low, casting long, twisting shadows on the ground. The air was cold, and every little sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig felt magnified. As I walked, the beam of my flashlight flickering on the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It started as a nagging thought in the back of my mind, easily dismissed at first, but the longer I walked, the stronger the feeling became, until it was almost unbearable. I stopped, listening intently, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the soft sigh of the wind through the trees. I told myself I was imagining things, that the darkness and isolation were playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried to shake the feeling, it persisted. Then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the wind like the distant creaking of wood. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but slow and deliberate. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the trees. The sound grew louder, closer, but I couldn't see anything. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching me, waiting. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickened my pace, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The footsteps, or whatever was making the sound, were relentless. They seemed to follow me no matter how fast I walked, always matching my pace, always just out of sight. Every time I stopped to listen, they stopped too, as if mocking me, daring me to turn around. I fought the urge to run, knowing that if I did, I might trip or lose my sense of direction entirely. But fear was coursing through my veins, making it harder to think clearly. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, and my breaths came quicker, each one more ragged than the last. The flashlight flickered again, its beam weakening. "Not now," I muttered under my breath, shaking it, trying to get it to work properly. It stuttered back to life, but the dim light didn't comfort me. I knew it wouldn't last much longer, and the thought of being trapped out here in complete darkness was enough to push me to the edge of panic. That's when I saw something up ahead, a faint glow between the trees. For a split second, relief washed over me. Maybe it was another hiker, maybe even a campsite. I quickened my pace, heading toward the light, hoping to find someone, anyone. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The light wasn't coming from a campsite or even a flashlight. It was an unnatural glow, pale and cold, like moonlight but much dimmer. And it was coming from deep within the forest, off the trail. Against my better judgment, I followed it. My heart told me to turn back, to stick to the path, but my mind was desperate for an explanation. I needed to know what was out there. As I approached, I saw what was casting the light, a small clearing, bathed in that eerie glow. In the center of the clearing stood a stone marker, ancient and covered in moss. It looked like an old gravestone, forgotten by time. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but something compelled me forward, as if the marker itself was calling me, pulling me closer. I took a step toward it, then another, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet of the night. As I reached the marker, I shined my flashlight on it, hoping to see some kind of inscription. But the stone was smooth, weathered by years of exposure. Suddenly, the forest around me grew impossibly still. The wind stopped, the trees no longer swayed, and even the insects had gone silent. The only sound was my own breathing, shaky and uneven. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, the flashlight flickered once more and went out completely, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me. I fumbled with the flashlight, but it was useless. I was alone in the pitch-black forest, the glowing stone behind me casting faint light on the clearing, but not enough to see beyond the trees. I couldn't stay here. I had to get back to the trail. But which way had I come from? That's when I heard it again, the slow, deliberate creaking of wood, like footsteps on brittle branches. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was close, too close. My heart leaped into my throat as I turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The clearing was empty, but I could feel something watching me, something just beyond the edge of the light. It was waiting for me to make a move, waiting for me to run. I swallowed hard and took a cautious step back, trying to stay calm. But the sound followed me, closer now, so close that I could almost feel it behind me. My muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at me to bolt, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. I had to keep my head. Then, without warning, something cold brushed against my neck, a sensation so faint I almost thought I imagined it. But the chill that shot down my spine was real. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the silent, suffocating darkness of the forest. I didn't wait any longer. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, no longer caring about the trail or which direction I was going. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between me and whatever was out there. The footsteps followed, faster now, no longer hiding. They matched my every movement, growing louder with each passing second. Branches whipped at my face, thorns snagged at my clothes, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept running, heart pounding, every muscle in my body screaming for me to keep going. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run any further, the trees thinned, and I saw it, the edge of the forest. I was almost out. With a final burst of energy, I sprinted toward the open ground, the footsteps still close behind me, but I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I burst out of the forest, gasping for breath, my legs trembling beneath me. I collapsed onto the ground, my chest heaving, but I didn't hear the footsteps anymore. Whatever had been following me, it had stopped at the tree line. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the night sky, trying to calm my racing heart. Eventually I made it back to my car, though I don't remember how. The forest loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I knew I'd never step foot in it again. Whatever was in those woods, whatever had been stalking me, it wasn't human, and it didn't want me to leave.
It was a spontaneous decision to camp in the forest, a last-minute trip to escape the noise of the city. I had been feeling suffocated by the everyday grind, so when a friend suggested we drive out to a secluded spot, I didn't hesitate. The idea of being surrounded by nature miles away from civilization sounded perfect. The first night was peaceful. We set up camp by a small lake, the only sounds being the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the soft hum of insects. As the sun set, casting an orange glow over the horizon, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. This was exactly what I needed. But the second night was different. It started with the wind. It picked up suddenly, rustling the leaves in a way that felt unnatural. The trees seemed to sway with purpose, as if they were communicating with each other, whispering secrets that only they could understand. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, the forest could play tricks on you when you were out here alone. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder. I lay in my tent, staring at the canvas ceiling, listening. The wind wasn't just rustling the leaves anymore. It was carrying something, words, faint and unintelligible, but unmistakably there. It sounded like voices, but distorted, like they were being spoken underwater. I sat up, my heart racing. I strained my ears, trying to catch a clear word or phrase, but it was impossible to make out. All I knew was that the voices were coming from the trees. I stepped out of the tent, flashlight in hand, scanning the woods. The beam illuminated the trunks of the trees, their branches shifting in the wind. But there was no one there, just the forest, dark and still. The whispers continued, louder now, circling me. It felt like they were closing in, surrounding the campsite. I spun around, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand as I tried to locate the source. But the more I searched, the clearer it became. Whatever was whispering, it wasn't coming from a person. It was the forest itself. The trees were speaking. I backed toward the tent, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. This couldn't be real. Trees didn't whisper. Forests didn't speak. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, the voices didn't stop. Suddenly, the wind died down, and with it, the whispers. The forest fell silent, but the silence was suffocating, thick with something unseen. I stood frozen, every nerve on edge, waiting for whatever was coming next. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. It was quick, barely visible in the darkness, but I knew it was there. I wasn't alone. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my bag, tore down the tent, and fled into the night, the forest watching as I ran. The trees whispered after me, but I didn't stop to listen. I never went back.